But today we've got them in person, kind of a follow-up on what we had, a taste of what we had last 5 years ago. Let me tell you a little bit of background, and then Karen and Don will fill you in as they present their program. After Wooster, they both got doctorates in chemistry. They'd majored in chemistry here, and then taught 10 years at St. Andrew's Presbyterian College in North Carolina. Following that, they spent 25 years in the D.C. area, where Dawn worked at the EPA, and Karen taught at a community college, both chemistry, and she began an ESL program. The ESL program teaching took her around the world, and finally led her to China, and then Dawn joined her in 1999. For the first 3 years, they worked summers only, and then full-time. And they will fill you in and fill us all in on their programs and what they've been doing in their second careers. Let me say, thanks, Dawn. Karen.
Well, thank you, Nikki. It's good to be here in downtown Wooster. Got it. Here we are. It's good to be here speaking live from downtown Wooster rather than from downtown China, where, as you recall, it's 12 hours difference. So last time we were 2 o'clock in the morning. This is a more civilized hour, and if you doze off, I won't forget it. What we'd like to do today is to let's see. So if we can turn the lights down, perhaps, so we can read the screen a bit better. Okay, that's the color of the PowerPoint. Okay, it says, are you from China? Not are you from Wooster, but are you from China? Which one? The background red does not show up well on this, but there are only 5 slides with the background red, and I'll tell you what they say. First of all, okay. Let's see here. Advance. How do I get it to? Let's see, that would not do it. Okay. Trying to advance using the clicker or using the. Okay, let's see. Don't get any response from anything. I'm sure help is on the way. Yes. What we want to do is to talk about 5 different areas. First of all, we're going to talk about when we went to China, where we went in China, what we saw in China. And under seeing in China, we're going to tell you about some of the places we went to and focus on the churches that we saw in China and give you a little bit of background.
Hit that button.
Okay, okay, there we are. So in China, you can look at the concept of China as a tourist location or a anthropological site where you can still see these kinds of situations. You can look at China from a military point of view and an increasing, some people say, threat and challenge. You can look at it as a place of significant urban development and advancement in all kinds of technology and so on. But you can also look at it in terms of the people, and we're going to try to look at it from all of these points of view, but all of them we're going to be looking at China. What we're going to be looking at, as it says, is when we went there, where we went, what we saw and experienced, looking at the city side and the countryside, focus on the churches, and then come back and look at the people. And as we have time, we'll try to take a summary look at what we've learned while we were there and what that means for us here in the United States and for all of us in the world. So with that as a general introduction, let me turn it over to Karen, who will lead us through the when we went and where we went.
Yes. Can you hear me? All right. I know you can't see, but I will tell you just a little bit as an introduction before Dawn gives a lot more light on the subject. Okay, actually I'm going first because I went first. In 1988, it was the centennial year of a famous missionary, a Virginia lady named Lottie Moon, sometimes called a Baptist saint, and we Baptists do not have many saints. But she lived in China for nearly 40 years. She came home one time. And she lived in northeastern China in a province called Shandong, which sticks out at the corner up toward Korea. In those days, you had to have a visa to go to China, of course, and then you had to have a visa to go into this province. But we were able to do that and to see some of the places where she walked and talked and taught. And we also had a chance to see some of the highlights of China. And you will no doubt recognize a number of the names, so I would like to ask you, as I mention these places, if you've been there, would you just raise your hand? In addition to Lottie Moon's Shandong province, we went to Beijing. Whoa, that's at least half the group. Okay, how about Shanghai? All right. Hong Kong. Whoa, was this all one tour, or have you been going all this time and you didn't visit us when you came? Xi'an, Terracotta Warriors. Okay, that's about half the group. And Guilin. All right. Guilin is down in the south. It's famous for its dragon tooth mountains. All of the painted scrolls that we used to see with these gorgeous mountains in the clouds, and I thought they were imaginary, but they are not. They're real. Everything, you can find it somewhere in China. Well, 10 years later, Don was getting ready to retire from the Environmental Protection Agency. I had been going in the summers to various places to do ESL workshops and camps, but he was going to retire. And he said, well, if you can find a place to go and volunteer for a month in China, I will do one of these summer mission trips. So we hunted around and we found an opportunity in 1999 to go for 4 weeks with a group called Amity Foundation. It is, and it was the start of our off and on, 10 years cumulative time in China. Now, Amity Foundation is an NGO. It's located in Nanjing, and it has several missions. One of them is to print the Bible. And they have a Bible printing press there, and they print more Bibles at that printing plant than in any other country in the world. So check your newest Bible and see if it's made in China. They also, they look for foreign experts to do various things that Chinese groups ask for help with. So they look for teachers. They look for doctors. They look for development specialists, and so on. And so they were looking for teachers, and they bring foreign teachers for the whole year, and also for summer camps for junior, senior high school English teachers who don't have much chance to speak. They know their grammar, they read well, they probably spoke well when they were in college, but after 10 years of doing nothing but talking English to 7th graders, how much progress do you make? So we formed a little group and we went to Shandong, Lottie Moon's province, and teachers came in from the countryside, and we all lived at a teacher's college there and spoke English all day and into the night for 4 weeks. Now, that grew. We did that 3 summers, and we began to say, and Don especially began to say, when I retire, I could do this all year. Because we started out as university teachers, and we've been teaching various things, and we said we could teach at a Chinese university. And if you ever go and do anything for the Chinese, they will say, oh, why don't you come back and do this full time? So we took an invitation and went to teach in southwest China. After 6 years, we went to Beijing and taught for a couple of years, and then down to Guangzhou, which is near Hong Kong, for the last 3 years. So here are the places I've mentioned, in case you're a visual learner instead of an oral listener. Shandong twice, Yunnan, which is in the west. That's where Kunming is. People here, anybody here been to Kunming? It is known as the Spring City. It's a very popular tourist place, but it is in the west of China, so it takes a while to get around there. Jiangsu, 2 places in Jiangsu, that's where Nanjing is, very close to Shanghai, but poor, not in the big cities. Inner Mongolia and Gansu, which is out near the Muslim areas in the far northwest. So, we're supposed to be experts and we're supposed to be helping them out, but what a way to see China. Here are the schools. Guangxi University, which is a second-tier school down near Vietnam. Peking University, which is the premier, they would say this is the Harvard of China. And then South China University of Technology, eventually they learned that not only did Don speak English very well, but he was from the Environmental Protection Agency and had served there for 25 years, and maybe he could teach environmental chemistry and toxicology. And that would be more valuable even than English. So that's what he did. For a final quick view, and doesn't this look like a rooster to you? Up in the northeast, you can see, this is Shandong. This star is in Shandong, and you can see the little duck head that points out toward a small thing that drops down, that's Korea. Here, Guangxi, down by Vietnam. Back on the east coast and up to Beijing. Inner Mongolia. Inner Mongolia is huge. We were on the far east side. This is the area near Hong Kong where they speak Cantonese rather than Mandarin. And then finally, an opportunity to be out in the west. So even though we feel like we've been to a lot of places, we still have a lot of places to go. And if you get a chance, there are plenty of places besides Beijing and Shanghai and Hong Kong to see on your second time around. Now, living and working in a place, as you all well know, is more than seeing how many places you can go, how many t-shirts you can get, and that sort of thing. It's trying to meet the people, trying to get out of the cities, trying to get into the countryside. So Don is going to tell you a little bit about how the Chinese enabled us to get around their country and experience it more deeply.
Karen mentioned the T-shirts that people get and bring back. They also like baseball caps, and it is not true that we have a baseball cap that says "Make China Great Again." That's not true. That's not true. Okay, so let's dive right in. We got going very quickly. Some of us seem to enjoy it more than others. Some people are a little more conservative about the way they dived in. But this is, of course, is Beijing. You can tell perhaps by the big city, but more directly by the smog. And those who go on sort of package tours, unfortunately, you end up in a lot of the places like this. Big modern cities, international cities, and so on, with lots of modern things. But not everything in the cities are modern. You can see pictures of people who are laboring hard to just get ahead, if you will. But some things are up to date, and I'll just give you a brief picture of the subway system in Beijing. This is what it looks like today. You can travel nearly anywhere you want. When we first went there, it was a quarter from any stop to any other stop on any of the lines that you wanted to do. There was obviously operating at a great deficit, but that was the way they did it. They have very modern trains, they have modern subway stations, they're used by lots of people. And just a few factoids, there are 18 subway lines today. When we first went there in 2002, there were only 2 lines. There are now 18. There are now 334 subway stations in the city of Beijing. 22 of those stations opened in just 1 year. They carry 9 million passengers every weekday, and every year they carry over 3 billion people on their subway system. It's not only the subway systems that are advanced, but also the Beijing airport that was opened for the 2008 Olympics is a marvel in itself, a huge structure. This is a subway, and this is an airport in the capital of one of the outlying provinces that some of you may have heard of, and Karen mentioned, is Kunming. Beautiful architecture that is oftentimes designed by Western architects, increasingly designed by Chinese architects, but they've gone around the world and tried to find the best architects in the world to provide some of the most striking architecture you'll find anywhere. But they do some things differently in China, as you might expect from the way they do it in the West, and this is just one example. They love trees. They don't have a whole lot of trees, but they do not sacrifice their trees easily. They will transplant trees that are 2 and 3 stories tall and tote them from one part of the city to another as they tear down one part of the city to move it to another. And yet, they also have not forgotten some of their skills of moving things by tricycle. This is a picture at a university where they were taking things from one classroom to another. Some things are done the old-fashioned way. Hand painting of lane markings on the highways. I haven't seen that in the U.S. for nearly in my lifetime, but in Beijing, this is just right outside our room by the university. But the country is changing, and that's why you get this mix of the modern and the traditional. In 2002, 70% of the Chinese lived in rural parts of the land. What percentage of Americans live on the farm these days? It's about 6%, that's right. And in China, when we first went there, it was 70%. And here we are just a little, about 13 years later, and that's gone from 70% down to 50%. And their plans are that in the next couple of years, next few years, they will move about 100 million people from into urban areas from the countrysides. There's a real emphasis to move people into the urban areas where services can be provided in a more efficient manner. And so this means people are on the move. They're moving from the bucolic sorts of small farms, certainly by the Western standards, very small plots. They're moving from that where they are used to seeing the back end of a buffalo most of the day. We have a friend who started life this way, and he is now the vice president of a bank in a medium-sized city in China, and twice a month he goes to Beijing to take part in discussions that lead to billion-dollar loans to various places throughout the country. So he started life behind the buffalo, and now he's one of the leaders in the financial system in China. So you can see how things have changed so rapidly. In the countryside, the social units and social activities were very simple and not very complex at all. The homes, very rustic, I guess to put a good spin on the term. This is what was seen as a perfectly fine urban, rural kitchen. Actually pretty well outfitted. Cleanliness is not quite up to what the FDA standards would be, but the food was very good. The living room might look something like this, with a bit of a family altar, the almost requisite picture of Mao, who is revered in the countryside, which is where his power base was, and something of a joke in many of the urban areas. President Xi Jinping is trying to change the country's attitude towards and rekindle the spirit of the communist revolution and the debt that they owe to the early communist leaders. But in the countryside, they've always held Mao in great regard. And in the countryside, your animals can help you clean up after the meat market, so you don't have to worry about that quite so much. But things don't always work quite the way you thought. They're trying to figure out how to leverage their mechanical devices in the most efficient way. We ran across this one when we were out one afternoon. So it's moving from that countryside to something like this, which is a high-rise apartment, of which there are millions, I suspect, in China. And although the people from the countryside may not be able to live in them immediately, these are the kinds of jobs that these former farmers will have, is to provide services to those who do live in the high-rises. Instead of looking at the back end of a buffalo, you're looking at the back end of the car in front of you. This is a huge traffic jam north of Beijing that made the news here in America. It was very unusual, but traffic is increasingly heavy in China. On a more typical day, this is what you might see. This is not obviously not a good traffic day, but this is not an unusual traffic day in some Chinese cities. And when you realize that there's not anybody on the road who's been driving for more than 15 years, and so these are all neophytes out there at the same time, it's not always a pretty picture. And you can go out and see some beautiful parks in China and in the cities, particularly when they're in flower, but you'll never be alone. There are many, many people, and that's even in the parks. But you won't be free from hard work. There's hard work to be done in the cities, and that's why, in some cases, they want more people to come from the countryside to engage in the hard work in the cities. In the cities, you can see some reminders of home. This looks more like a village setting, but it is actually a picture at Ramadan in one of the cities where people were picking up meat to take home. When they get to the cities, they'll find schools. It's a very typical kind of school situation, anywhere from 40 to 60, I guess would be sort of the average, but we've been in schools that had 80 and in some cases over 100 students in rooms like this. They sit on wooden benches, 3 in front of a desk, usually piled with books for all their classes, because rather than going through the mess of having the children move from class to class, it's the teachers who move. And all your books are sitting right in front of you. But they do get their exercise in a very corporal way to go out and do exercises and so on. They do get some instruction from foreign visitors, such as myself, and they are very compliant and willing to have their various body parts, head, nose, and mouth covered up so that they can learn the vocabulary. And so we had a great time coming into the city, seeing the schools and so on. But we were also we were not formally missionaries, but we made it a point to work with the churches wherever we went, to learn about them, to be a part of them, to participate with them, and to help them as we could. And so we saw many churches in China, and just to give you a sense of what churches are in China, when they left the village, this is the kind of church they may have left behind. There's a hole in the roof of this church, but there's a cross on the wall, and if you look over here on the right, I'm not sure if you can see it in this picture, but there's a Christmas tree and a picture of Santa Claus. So this gives the whole picture of Christianity in the countryside. We also walked up into the mountains, and one of the most inspiring experiences we had was when we went to a far-off village up in the mountains, and we were greeted by the villagers who came out and sang to us the Hallelujah chorus. On the hillside, in the mist, and as we marched up, we felt we were marching into heaven. It was just amazing. In the small towns, we were in churches, standing room only. There are bookstores to buy Bibles, to buy all kinds of Christian literature, including a Chinese translation of The Faith of George W. Bush. So if you haven't read it, you can go and read it in Chinese. And in the cities, there are some small churches still to be seen, but most churches you see in the city are large, very dramatic churches, almost Disneyland in some ways. This is a church in Kunming again, where in the service that we went to, we saw 80 people baptized on the one Sunday morning. And these were all people who had been through a new members class that they had to attend for a series of months, like 2 or 3 months, and then you qualify for baptism. These are other churches in other towns, but again, very striking, and nothing subtle about their presence on the cityscape or on the landscape. Inspiring everywhere you go. But if you do go to a church in China, and it's not hard to do that, you'd better get there early. This is near a university in Beijing in the spring, and this is a line of people who are standing in the rain waiting for the English service. At this particular church, there are 5 services on Sunday morning where they seat about 800 in each service, and for the English service, you had better get there early to get in line, because when all the seats are filled, that's all there is. This is in the springtime at that church, and this is in the wintertime at that church, and there we are standing in the snow waiting for the church to begin. And most of the people who were at this church were young people from the university settings and so on. And these are the registered churches that we're talking about. By registered, in China they talk about the Protestant religion and the Catholic religion. They make a severe distinction. Perhaps the way it was when you and I were kids, at least where I grew up in Akron, there was a big distinction between Catholics and Protestants, not so much anymore. But in China, that's still there. And the Protestant churches who are registered belong to a group. It's a non-denominational, but they refer to themselves as the Three Self-Patriotic Church, the TSP Church, or Teaspoon Church, we would call it. And that means they are self-governing. That is, they don't have any foreign leaders. That all the leadership of the church is Chinese. They are self-supporting, that the majority of their funds come from the congregation themselves or donors from China, and self-propagating. That is, that there are no foreign missionaries. And our experience has been that they are very evangelical, meaning that they are interested in spreading the gospel. They see that as an important part of their function as a church. And these churches, registered churches that are headed up by Chinese, are open to foreigners. So we could go there. In addition to those registered churches, and there are 14 large ones in Beijing, there are hundreds, there are probably thousands of unregistered churches in China. And by unregistered, we mean that they don't sign up with a government and fill out a form and so on. Unregistered doesn't mean that they are unknown. The government knows exactly where they are, probably knows exactly who's a member, and some of them are fairly large, hundreds of people in their congregation. While we were there, one of them was featured on the front page of a government newspaper and talked about all the good things that the church was doing in terms of service and so on. But within a year after that headline story, something ran afoul, and the church ran into trouble, and they're still trying to work that out. So the unregistered churches have perhaps a little more difficult time, but they also push the envelope a bit more than would be the case. They are not open to foreigners legally, and we made it a point during all of our time in China never to go to an unregistered church, because we would, the worst they could do is tell us not to go there. or tell us to go back to America, but it would redound to the disbenefit of the Chinese if we went to be with them. And so these churches have mixed relationships with their governments. And it oftentimes depends upon the local situation in which the church finds itself. Sometimes it's a matter of personality conflicts between the leaders of the church and the leaders of the government in that locality. I'm sorry? We did. Yeah, right. The atheistic communist government paid for us to come, paid us a round trip. They paid us at the average salary of a Chinese teacher. They gave us a room. They gave us internet connection. At our last place, we had 3 bedrooms and 2 TVs. We had to provide for our own food and so on. We didn't get rich, but this atheistic communist government really wanted us to come. They knew we were Christians. We didn't hide it. And the students knew that we were Christians. And we were told that in a classroom we were not allowed to, quote, proselytize in the classroom. But they said, if students after class want to come and talk to you or ask you questions about that, answer their questions. Because that's why you're here, is to tell about the culture of America. And part of the culture of America they understood is Christianity. And so we were there at their invitation, and we felt as though God blessed us in that, and during the time that we have been there. This window will not always be open, I'm sure. But that's why I would encourage you or your grandchildren to think about taking advantage of this while the advantage is there. Just some interesting factoids. The number of Christians in China is about equal to the number of communists in China. Within a generation, most people who study this say that there will be likely be more Christians in China than in any other country in the world. And that Karen has already mentioned that there are more Bibles published in China already than there are in any other country in the world, and that already Chinese Christians have a vision of evangelizing the world, beginning with the Muslim world. There's this movement called Back to Jerusalem. The Chinese Christians say, okay, Christianity started in the Middle East, it went to Europe, it came to the United States. The United States brought it to Japan and Korea and to China, and as you keep going around, it is up to us now to take the gospel back to Jerusalem. And they are sending missionaries, sometimes to their death, to take the gospel into Muslim countries, which are not necessarily welcoming to do this. So it's an exciting activity that's going on. Well, I'll move on to the next one and sort of close here to have time for questions. What did we see and what did we experience in terms of people? Well, China. Somebody asked me earlier, how do the Chinese look upon race relations or diversity in America? Well, China has its own diversity. They say there's something like 55 minorities in China. And the way they have organized it and presented it, they see it as all one harmonious group. It's not exactly, but when you go to parts of China, you can see the people dressed in their native costumes and so on, living their lives. There are certain regions that are called autonomous regions. An example is the Zhuang Autonomous Region. And this is the picture of the Zhuang people, where we lived for 6 years. By law, this whole province has to be, the leader has to be a Zhuang person from this minority group called the Zhuang. So they've got a different way to deal with it, but one of the minorities is not black. And when American blacks go there, they feel prejudice. Maybe it's part of the human condition that people who look too much different are going to be the subject of some sort of discrimination. But the young and the old, there's what they call long life villages in China, which for reasons which people really don't understand, people live to be a ripe old age. We shook hands with a man who's 107. His daughter, who is 92, was returning from the rice fields with a hoe over her back, walking up the hill to, I guess, fix dinner for her father or whatever it was. But and of course, everybody loves children. Again, during the time that we were there, there's been a tremendous movement towards acknowledging disabled people. When we first went there, it was the sort of thing you didn't talk about, almost the way it was when we were kids in America. This is a man who is blind. The Christian group called Amity that Karen mentioned early on has trained him now to make incense sticks, so-called joy sticks, for burning at the temple, and he gets paid now for doing this. So a Christian group has taught him this trade and given him a certain amount of self-worth, and actually now has elevated his position in the village. This is a good friend of ours who I someday would hope to make a movie about his life. When he was 5 years old, he was on the wrong end of a dynamite explosion, and he lost his right hand and has only 2 fingers in his left hand. Because of that, he was sort of shunted around from relative to relative. Nobody wanted him because he couldn't do anything. He went into a life of crime, smuggling, and so on. All kinds of things went on. And one day he shows up in my class at the university wanting to study English, and he knew a certain amount of English. I now talk to him on the telephone every week, and his English is much better than some of the students at university. He has now gone back to China has started a program they call Open University, that people like him can go to special universities for free. People-to-people activities. This is Karen working with children in a countryside elementary school. This is her at a rural church. We walked in there one weekday afternoon, and because we were foreigners and she was as pretty as she always is, the children came out to look at her, and they went and gathered flowers and brought her this bouquet. This is us at the home of a country friend, enjoying a meal with him and his extended family. And so what is friendship? That's one of the things we've really learned in China, is what friendship is all about. And what are we here for? And so we like to say that friendship is sharing an umbrella on a rainy day. And this is a picture of one of our Chinese friends taking care of Karen on a rainy day, sharing an umbrella. For me, the picture of friendship is implanting a pacemaker at midnight on the last 4th of July. We were on our way to Inner Mongolia for 3 weeks. The way the Lord had it figured out, that this was a bad idea. And so just before we were supposed to get on the plane, we ran into this surgeon, Dr. Lee, who's a remarkable story in herself. And at midnight on the 4th of July, she implanted a pacemaker in my heart. And as I tell her that I think of her with every beat of my heart. And she's a remarkable person. She knows English reasonably well. I'd say high intermediate, let's say. And many of her colleagues, she's the head of cardiology, many of her colleagues do not know English nearly as well. And so we are working out a system to extend our friendship. And what we can do is we can have a Skype conversation between ourselves in Alexandria, Virginia, and between her and her 8 colleagues in the cardiac care unit in Guangzhou. And we can have an English lesson once a week. So this is the way international relations of the future, I think, are going to be developed and formed. So what did we learn? Well, we learned new cooking skills. So if you come to visit us in Alexandria, Karen will put on a cooking demonstration. Next time she said she would wear asbestos gloves, however. In this picture she didn't. We learned that things are not always what they seem to be. You can stand on the Great Wall and you can really get some strange feelings on the Great Wall. We also learned some new therapeutic treatments, such as acupuncture. This is Karen with a needle in the back of her head, dealing with her migraine headaches. And another thing is cupping. I'm not sure if you've heard of cupping, where suction is applied to the back or wherever the pain happens to be. And this is a Chinese swimmer who has experienced this cupping. They create a vacuum, and that draws the blood into this area, and they leave it on for maybe 15 minutes, and you actually end up bruising. It's an intentional bruising. That's I guess the way we look at it. They say it's sucking out the bad vapors or whatever. But in the coming Olympics, when you look at the swimmers from China, you will likely see some of these spots on their backs. And it's the result of their having been given this therapeutic cupping. And Karen got this, but she didn't want me to show the pictures. She thought that I would be accused of wife abuse or something like that. We also learned there are many grateful people. This is, we were out one afternoon climbing up the hill, ran into it's a group of older people, and he's telling us here how when he was a kid, he remembers the airplanes coming in over the mountains into southern China, landing and helping against the fight of the Japanese. He told us that sometimes those planes didn't make it, and he remembers going out to the wreckage of those planes and playing around in the wreckage. But they knew that that those planes were flown by Westerners, many of them Americans. This is a plaque by the entrance of the largest church in the capital of the province of Yunnan. It's written in Chinese, and below it says in English, "To the worship of God, in the memory of Allied soldiers who died in China, 1937 to 1945. Right at the front of entrance to the church. Anybody who goes into that church sees this sign. So there's a reservoir of good feeling and appreciation and a great debt of gratitude that is felt, particularly by the older generation, but is also recognized by the younger generation. And we feel as though the United States is missing a great opportunity to capitalize on that. We come back from China and are astonished about the negative reports that we read about China, almost exclusively negative reports about China. There are a lot of negative things to say about China, don't get me wrong. China has got all kinds of problems. The Chinese will tell you what their problems are, but that there are many good things to say about China, and but the message I would leave is the people there are really loving and loving. So what are the possibilities of relationships with China? We should be walking together, sharing an umbrella, whether in rain or in shine. In China, we found that when it's hot like this in China, everybody carries an umbrella. So they carry the umbrella all the time. A take-home message we will leave you is to realize that the future need not be determined by the present. And so you read the pundits, you read the things about U.S. and China relations, and people are looking at some dots in the past that are real, they're there, and connecting a line and drawing, we think, very negative pictures. It doesn't have to be negative. It does not have to be negative. In a time when we have means of relationships that were undreamed of when you and I were at Wooster, Wooster did a good job of helping us have a worldview, but now the challenge is even more so. You may or may not know that every day 1,000 Americans land in China. Every day 1,000 Chinese land in 1,000 Chinese come to America, 1,000 Americans go to China every day. That vastly exceeds the number of people from the State Department who go to China or the number of Chinese foreign ministry people who come to the United States. There's more people-to-people contact than there is government-to-government relationships. And what I would challenge the good folks at Wooster, and I can include you in that, is how can we capitalize on the new techniques and mechanisms that are available to us that were literally undreamed of just a short while ago, to have those mechanisms utilized in some way that would advance situations. We come back here and all we read about is, oh, China is hacking this, that, and the other. No mention of the fact that we might possibly be hacking them. I mean, let's not talk about that. But let's move beyond that. Here I am going to be, Karen and I are going to be teaching English to this Chinese surgeon and her colleagues. When we have a Chinese, every Friday night, we have dinner with 50 Chinese students and scholars from universities in America. One of them is on a Fulbright scholarship. He's been here 6 months. Both he and his wife during that time have fallen among Christians. And both of them have professed belief in Christ and have joined the Capitol Hill Baptist Church. This is happening every day. You don't hear much about that. How do we build upon these greater exchanges that we have? Well, I leave that to you to think about and to perhaps ask us questions about. So in the time that does remain, which is about 15 minutes, we'd be happy to engage with you in a conversation about what happens next. Thank you. Are you live? Okay, maybe you should be. Yes, sir.
How do you think we've experienced very similar things? Our church in Wilmington started a mission in China, in Xi'an, Jiangsu province,
Okay.
in the 1890s.
Oh.
And it thrived. And about 10 years ago, a businessman was going into a church there, and it said this church was founded by the hospital, church, and school, but founded by the generosity of the First Presbyterian Church of Wilmington.
Wow. My goodness.
And everybody thought it was Wilmington, Delaware. It turned out to be Wilmington, North Carolina.
Wow.
And a doctor had gone there and established a church, a school, and a hospital. And currently that hospital is the largest regional hospital in the whole thing. The church now, I think, has 23,000 members around.
Whoa.
And the school has become the regional school. And our church established a relationship with them and had 3 visits of dignitaries, groups from that Chinese church body in that area. And then we have in turn sent, I think, 4 different trips back.
Wow.
So that sounds really good. But the amazing thing is that no one is interested in Chinese relationships. People do, as you say, hang on to these archaic images of China that are coolies on buffaloes, and that they're totally, atheists, and will murder any missionary who goes there, and so on. And so there's such a disconnect between what is happening in China and not only Americans, but I'm appalled at the religious community's lack of interest.
Wow.
We started the Chinese network, and there's like a church in Shadyside and one in California. We try to convene a group, and maybe a dozen, people are interested. So that challenge you're throwing out is one, because I think there's no greater need to create relationships of meaning between America and China during this period, which is one of opportunity.
Amen.
So, I don't know how we can, work together to create that, but I love what you said. That gives me at least optimism.
Right. Well, that's great. Well, let me just pursue another aspect of it. When we first went there, maybe after a year or two, we were very much excited about what was there. The vitality of the church and the relationship between the local church and the local government was actually pretty good. And there's something in Washington, D.C. called the Congressional Executive Commission on China. The president appoints some members and Congress appoints some members, and they have the responsibility of tracking the situation in China. Now, everything in Washington is political. And so it turns out that Mr. Rubio is a member of that group and some others. But we went to talk to them because we live in Washington, and we said, we've read some of your stuff, and we know that there are some places where there are difficulties between the government and religion and so on. But let us tell you about where we have lived. And it's a good news story. And they, at that time, they were planning to travel to China. And we said, you ought to travel to our town and let us show you and introduce you to the people and see how this thing should work. And that'd be a good model for you to tell other parts of people in China. The senior staff member was a guy who was a Chinese American. And he sort of pulled us aside and he said, I like your enthusiasm, I like what you're trying to say, but let me tell you what really is happening here with this Congressional Executive Commission on China. We could, if we go to China, come visit your town. But let me tell you, if we come to your town, we will find something wrong. Because our commission is in the business of finding things wrong. Our members only get credit and mention in their hometown newspaper if we say something bad about China. And so even though it's a good news story, we'll be able to turn that into a bad news story. And he said, do you want us to come? And I said, please don't. And I felt so bad. Here I am, an American, believing in truth and open and all this sort of stuff, telling my government, I don't want you to come because I think what you're going to do is evil. Frightening, just frightening. Yes, ma'am.
All the churches that you showed, if I was studying, there are that many, have they been originated by missionaries, or did they just grow out of Chinese people from other churches there?
Karen, do you want to answer that?
There were missionaries. The
question was, the
yes.
churches that we saw, are these the result of missionary activities in the past, or have they somehow been developed by the Chinese themselves?
And the answer is yes, both. But the missionary period, the modern missionary period, was basically 1850 to 1950. And the first missionaries who came often came with foreign governments who were not wanted, sort of came in at the point of a gun. They built many churches. They took the gospel many places, but they maintained a certain amount of control rather than having the Chinese in control. So when the communists won the Civil War in 1949, they began to expel all the missionaries. Some of them were killed. Many of them were sent out, and they went to Taiwan, and they went to Hong Kong and Japan and all over the world, and there were no more missionaries. But their buildings remained. And the Chinese congregations continued to meet in these churches. And the churches were widespread. There were churches out in the far west because the French came up through Vietnam and came in and so on. But when the Cultural Revolution began in 1966, the communists closed every house of worship. Muslim, very few Jews. Buddhists, I always thought all the Chinese were Buddhists. They closed all the temples, they closed all the churches, everything. And people went underground for 10 years. Then, as things began to reopen, the Christians began to stick their heads up and to show themselves. Turned out that there were a lot more Christians by then than they thought went underground. So whatever they were doing there were a goodly number of Christians. And as the pressure pulled off, the government began to give church buildings that were still decent back to the Christians. Christians had to fix them up. They might have been stables, they might have been offices. One of the places we served, it had been a library. And so when we first came to the town, they were meeting in a factory, and then they met in a store that wasn't open on Sunday morning. But they were redoing the original church, and it looked German. It was a German Lutheran church. You can tell that this was a Presbyterian church, that this was a Baptist church. In Guangzhou, we went to a church, and the sign said, "We are grateful to the missionaries who in Southern Baptist missionaries, 1920, built this church." Well, the Japanese didn't do too much damage, so when the Christians got it back, they fixed it up. Now, the Chinese are building many things. They build gorgeous structures for the Olympics. They have more highways, 4-lane highways than we do now, and they're building churches, and when they build a church, they don't build a little church. You know, China is big. So your church, it only seats 1,000. Let's see if we can make it bigger. So the churches are reappearing, and new churches are appearing all over the country. But as Don mentioned, the 3 self, they have to be led by Chinese. So there are no missionaries. When we began to open relationships with China, our representatives, our president said, you know, we would like to see the Bible back in China. Okay, let's start this Bible printing. We would like to see the churches open. Well, okay, that's taking time. Some churches, they're still arguing over the property. We would like to have the missionaries come back. No way, no, never. So it is to be Chinese run. And it's enforced in various ways around the country. We taught English classes in the church in the first city where we lived. And they had to get permission from the Government Religion Bureau for foreigners to teach English in that church. But we got it. We had a friend 50 miles up the road. The pastor in his church wanted him to do it. The local government said, no, no foreigners teaching English, even English in the church. So it's a very varied kind of situation. And that when you talk about when the missionaries came, especially in Jiangsu, on the East Coast, where most of the missionaries were, famous school, Peking University, was started by Christians. Now, when you try to dig back in the history, you have to dig pretty long and pretty hard before somebody will tell you that. But it was a Christian school, and then it was taken over by the government. So when the communists came in, all the Christian schools were taken over. So they're now Chinese run. The hospitals were taken over, and now they're all Chinese run. And the churches are all Chinese run.
And that's the registered churches. But
Yes.
But the other point is there are thousands of these unregistered churches, which are much smaller. They meet in homes. They meet in restaurants and things like that.
Yeah.
And some of them are people are just really very committed and very devoted. We know that many of them. We don't go to their services because we feel as though we were putting them in jeopardy. But it's that movement, perhaps more than the registered churches, that have this great evangelical zeal. But just to close on this one note, the first church we were in, the pastor stood up and said, look, I've been a preacher at this church for, I think it was 4 years or 8 years, I forget which it was. I've been here for this many years, and our membership has only grown by 40%. Only grown by 40%. He says, if we're really going to be serious about spreading the gospel, folks, we've got to do better. And we all laugh at that. Said, if only by the grace of God, any of our churches could hold themselves together or grow by 2% over 5 years, we would think that would be remarkable. So God is at work. Christians are at work. And there's a lot going on in China. And if your grandchildren are going to know Chinese people, either by going there or being online with them or going to the university. University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, big engineering school, 10% of the enrolled students are Chinese. 10%.
And they have a Chinese church on their campus. And this is one aspect when you're trying to make contact with Chinese here in this country. because it's a chance to really have an influence. I think you need to link with Chinese Christians in this country. And they have a number of national programs where they will set up a program. We have 3 of them in the DC area. They have them all over the country. If you can link with dynamic Christian Chinese here and say, what can we do to help? Not what can we do to lead, but what can we do to help? Your church and you may be able to make contact and begin to be effective.
I think one thing we have to say, it's a non-denominational church, so the challenge to the Protestant community is that we have to come together with an understanding of religion in a different way outside of our Baptist, Presbyterian, Lutheran heritage. And that's a very exciting, I think, and challenging reality. 3 of our 4 grandkids were raised and born in China, and it's an amazing world that we have to know more about. And this is a wonderful.
This has sort of a Wooster ring to it, frankly. And with that, we will say,
再见。
thank you.